Hello, everybody, and welcome to another late night Purblind Gamer audiobook stream. A nice and relaxing way to end the day and wind down. Unless, of course, you happen to be in some vastly different time zone, in which case, Purblind Gamer LLC is not responsible for you falling asleep at work while watching my stream, or falling asleep while driving while watching my stream. Maybe you shouldn't watch Twitch and drive. Maybe you shouldn't stream on Twitch and drive. Maybe you shouldn't drive, period. I know I don't. Well, I hope everybody's week is off to a good start. Mine is off to a predictably interesting start. Stuff to take care of. But I got home still finding I had a reasonable amount of energy left today, and I had said I would do another bonus stream, and we need to keep chipping away at this interesting mystery novel. So I thought I would just read a couple more chapters of The Circular Staircase tonight. Did I actually get the title right this time? Yeah. And as last time I read some of this, I put The Spiral Staircase on the on-screen title and didn't realize it until the end. But you want to do that. Yeah. Call The Circular Staircase The Spiral Staircase, or The Helix of Death, which would actually make a good title for a novel. Oh yeah, and thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple streams. Last night we started Blackwell Epiphany and had a great deal of fun with it. And Saturday we played, Bewilder House for Short Horror Saturday. Yep. Does it seem like that was longer ago? What do I know? Exactly, Stock. They're all stairs or spirals, you know. The Twisted Ladder. Ah, yes. The Torqued Stair Climber Machine. Ah. Don't really get anywhere with that one. And as usual in these audiobook streams, I'll have text-to-speech chat turned off, and won't really respond to chat until the end of the chapters, just so I can keep the flow of reading, and eventually edit these together and chuck them up on LibriVox. I keep making threats like that. Yes. Using envelopes addressed to oneself as bookmarks. One must be careful about that when one is streaming. Yes, I believe we had ended when they had discovered that the local bank was going bankrupt. Jack had been accused of embezzling, and there'd been some mysterious person on the circular staircase once again, and Halsey had chased them and struggled with them, and then run out into the night, and he was just returning with Mrs. Watson, the housekeeper. Was she the one who'd been there? And that's where our mystery resumes. Chapter 12. One Mystery for Another. The most commonplace incident takes on a new appearance if the attendant circumstances are unusual. There was no reason on earth why Mrs. Watson should not have carried a blanket down the east wing staircase, if she so desired. but to take a blanket down at 11 o'clock at night, with every precaution as to noise, and, when discovered, to fling it at Halsey and bolt, Halsey's word, and a good one, into the grounds, this made the incident more than significant. They moved across the lawn and up the steps. Halsey was talking quietly, and Mrs. Watson was looking down and listening. She was a woman of a certain amount of dignity, most efficient, so far as I could see, although Liddy would have found fault if she dared. But just now, Mrs. Watson's face was an enigma. She was defiant, I think, under her mask of submission, and she still showed the effect of nervous shock. "Mrs. Watson," I said severely, "will you be so good as to explain this rather unusual occurrence?" "I don't think it's so unusual, Miss Innes." Her voice was deep and very clear. Just now it was somewhat tremulous. "I was taking a blanket down to Thomas, who is not well tonight, and I used this staircase, as being nearer the path to the lodge. When Mr. Innes called and then rushed at me, I was alarmed. I flung the blanket at him." Halsey was examining the cut on his forehead in a small mirror on the wall. It was not much of an injury, but it had bled freely, and his appearance was rather terrifying. "Thomas ill?" he said over his shoulder. "Why, I thought I saw Thomas out there as you made that cyclonic break out the door and over the porch." I could see that under pretense of examining his injury, he was watching her through the mirror. "Is this one of the servants' blankets, Mrs. Watson?" I asked, holding up its luxurious folds to the light. "Everyone else is locked away," she replied, which was true enough, no doubt. I had rented the house without bed furnishings. "If Thomas is ill," Halsey said, "some member of the family ought to go down to see him. You needn't bother, Mrs. Watson. I will take the blanket." She drew herself up quickly, as if in protest, but she found nothing to say. She stood smoothing the folds of her dead black dress, her face as white as chalk above it. Then she seemed to make up her mind. "Very well, Mr. Innes," she said. "Perhaps you would better go. I have done all I could." And then she turned and went up the circular staircase, moving slowly and with a certain dignity. Below, the three of us stared at one another across the intervening white blanket. "Upon my word," Halsey broke out, "this place is a walking nightmare. I have the feeling that we three outsiders who have paid our money for the privilege of staying in this spook factory are living on the very top of things. We are on the lid, so to speak. Now and then we get a sight of the things inside, but we are not a part of them." "Do you suppose," Gertrude asked doubtfully, "that she really meant that blanket for Thomas?" "Thomas was standing beside that magnolia tree," Halsey replied, "when I ran after Mrs. Watson. It's down to this, Aunt Ray. Rosie's basket and Mrs. Watson's blanket can only mean one thing. There is somebody hiding or being hidden in the lodge. It wouldn't surprise me if we hold the key to the whole situation now. Anyhow, I'm going to the lodge to investigate." Gertrude wanted to go too, but she looked so shaken that I insisted she should not. I sent for Liddy to put her to bed, and then Halsey and I started for the lodge. The grass was heavy with dew, and, manlike, Halsey chose the shortest way across the lawn. Halfway, however, he stopped. "We'd better go by the drive," he said. "This isn't a lawn, it's a field. Where's the gardener these days?" "There isn't any," I said meekly. "We have been thankful enough, so far, to have our meals prepared and served and the beds aired. The gardener who belongs here is working at the club." "Remind me tomorrow to send out a man from town," he said. "I know the very fellow." I record this scrap of conversation just as I have tried to put down anything and everything that had a bearing on what followed, because the gardener Halsey sent the next day played an important part in the events of the next few weeks, events that culminated, as you know, by stirring the county profoundly. At that time, however, I was busy trying to keep my skirts dry, and paid little or no attention to what seemed then a most trivial remark. Along the drive, I showed Halsey where I had found Rosie's basket with the bits of broken china piled inside. He was rather skeptical. "Warner, probably," he said when I had finished. "Began it as a joke on Rosie, and ended by picking up the broken china out of the road, knowing it would play hob with the tire of the car. Which shows how near one can come to the truth and yet miss it altogether." At the lodge everything was quiet. There was a light in the sitting room downstairs, and a faint gleam, as if from a shaded lamp, in one of the upper rooms. Halsey stopped and examined the lodge with calculating eyes. "I don't know, Aunt Ray," he said dubiously. "This is hardly a woman's affair. If there's a scrap of any kind, you hike for the timber," which was Halsey's solicitous care for me, put into vernacular. "I shall stay right here," I said, and crossing the small veranda, now shaded and fragrant with honeysuckle, I hammered the knocker on the door. Thomas opened the door himself. Thomas, fully dressed and in his customary health. I had the blanket over my arm. "I brought the blanket, Thomas," I said. "I am sorry you are so ill." The old man stood staring at me, and then at the blanket. His confusion under other circumstances would have been ludicrous. "What? Not ill?" Halsey said from the step. "Thomas, I'm afraid you've been malingering." Thomas seemed to have been debating something with himself. Now he stepped out on the porch and closed the door gently behind him. "I reckon you better come in, Miss Innes," he said, speaking cautiously. "It's got so I dunno what to do, and it's bound to come out some time or other." He threw open the door then, and I stepped inside, Halsey close behind. In the sitting room, the old negro turned with quiet dignity to Halsey. "You better sit down, sir," he said. "It's a place for a woman, sir." Things were not turning out the way Halsey expected. He sat down on the center table, with his hands thrust in his pockets, and watched me as I followed Thomas up the narrow stairs. At the top a woman was standing, and at second glance showed me it was Rosie. She shrank back a little, but I said nothing. And then Thomas motioned to a partly open door, and I went in. The lodge boasted 3 bedrooms upstairs, all comfortably furnished. In this one, the largest and airiest, a night lamp was burning, and by its light I could make out a plain white metal bed. A girl was asleep there, or in a half-stupor, for she muttered something now and then. Rosie had taken her courage in her hands, and coming in had turned up the light. It was only then that I knew. Fever-flushed, ill as she was, I recognized Louise Armstrong. I stood gazing down at her in a stupor of amazement. Louise here, hiding at the lodge, ill and alone. Rosie came up to the bed and smoothed the white counterpane. "I am afraid she is worse tonight," she ventured at last. I put my hand on the sick girl's forehead. It was burning with fever, and I turned to where Thomas lingered in the hallway. "Will you tell me what you mean, Thomas Johnson, by not telling me this before?" I demanded indignantly. Thomas quailed. "Miss Louise wouldn't let me," he said earnestly. "I wanted to. She ought to 'a' had a doctor the night she came, but she wouldn't hear to it. Is she very bad, Miss Innes?" "Bad enough," I said coldly. "Send Mr. Innes up." Halsey came up the stairs slowly, looking rather interested and inclined to be amused. For a moment he could not see anything distinctly in the darkened room. He stopped, glanced at Rosie and me, and then his eyes fell on the restless head on the pillow. I think he felt who it was before he really saw her. He crossed the room in a couple of strides and bent over the bed. "Louise," he said softly, but she did not reply, and her eyes showed no recognition. Halsey was young, and illness was new to him. He straightened himself slowly, still watching her, and caught my arm. "She's dying, Aunt Ray," he said huskily. "Dying? Why, she doesn't know me." "Fudge!" I snapped, being apt to grow irritable when my sympathies are aroused. "She's doing nothing of the sort, and don't pinch my arm. If you want something to do, go and choke Thomas." But at that moment Louise roused from her stupor to cough, and at the end of the paroxysm, as Rosie laid her back, exhausted, she knew us. That was all Halsey wanted. To him, consciousness was recovery. He dropped on his knees beside the bed and tried to tell her she was all right, and we would bring her round in a hurry, and how beautiful she looked, only to break down utterly and have to stop. And at that I came to my senses, and put him out. "This instant," I ordered, as he hesitated, "and send Rosie here." He did not go far. He sat on the top step of the stairs, only leaving to telephone for a doctor, and getting in everybody's way in his eagerness to fetch and carry. I got him away finally by sending him to fix up the car as a sort of ambulance in case the doctor would allow the sick girl to be moved. He sent Gertrude down to the lodge, loaded with all manner of impossible things, including an armful of Turkish towels and a box of mustard plasters, and as the two girls had known each other somewhat before, Louise brightened perceptibly when she saw her. When the doctor from Inglewood, the Casanova doctor, Dr. Walker, being away, had started for Sunnyside, and when I had got Thomas to stop trying to explain what he did not understand himself, I had a long talk with the old man, and this is what I learned. On Saturday evening before, about 10 o'clock, he had been reading in the sitting-room downstairs when someone rapped at the door. The old man was alone, Warner not having arrived, and at first he was uncertain about opening the door. He did so finally, and was amazed at being confronted by Louise Armstrong. Thomas was an old family servant, having been with the present Mrs. Armstrong since she was a child, and he was overwhelmed at seeing Louise. He saw that she was excited and tired, and he drew her into the sitting-room and made her sit down. After a while he went to the house and brought Mrs. Watson, and they talked until late. The old man said Louise was in trouble and seemed frightened. Mrs. Watson made some tea and took it to the lodge, but Louise made them both promise to keep her presence a secret. She had not known that Sunnyside was rented, and whatever her trouble was, this complicated things. She seemed puzzled. Her stepfather and her mother were still in California. That was all she would say about them. Why she had run away no one could imagine. Mr. Arnold Armstrong was at the Greenwood Club, and at last Thomas, not knowing what else to do, went over there along the path. It was almost midnight. Part way over, he met Armstrong himself and brought him to the lodge. Mrs. Watson had gone to the house for some bed linen, it having been arranged that under the circumstances Louise would be better at the lodge until morning. Arnold Armstrong and Louise had a long conference, during which he was heard to storm and become very violent. When he left, it was after 2. He had gone up to the house, Thomas did not know why, and at 3 o'clock he was shot at the foot of the circular staircase. The following morning Louise had been ill. She had asked for Arnold, and was told he had left town. Thomas had not the moral courage to tell her of the crime. She refused a doctor, and shrank morbidly from having her presence known. Mrs. Watson and Thomas had had their hands full, and at last Rosie had been enlisted to help them. She carried necessary provisions, little enough, to the lodge, and helped to keep the secret. Thomas told me quite frankly that he had been anxious to keep Louise's presence hidden for this reason. They had all seen Arnold Armstrong that night, and he himself, for one, was known to have had no very friendly feeling for the dead man. As to the reason for Louise's flight from California, or why she had not gone to the Fitzhughs or to some of her people in town, he had no more information than I had. With the death of her stepfather and the prospect of the immediate return of the family, things had become more and more impossible. I gathered that Thomas was as relieved as I at the turn events had taken. No, she did not know of either of the deaths in the family. Taken all around, I had only substituted one mystery for another. If I knew now why Rosie had taken the basket of dishes, I did not know who had spoken to her and followed her along the drive. If I knew that Louise was in the lodge, I did not know why she was there. If I knew that Arnold Armstrong had spent some time in the lodge the night before he was murdered, I was no nearer the solution of the crime. Who was the midnight intruder who had so alarmed Liddy and myself? Who had fallen down the clothes chute? Was Gertrude's lover a villain or a victim? Time was to answer all these things. Chapter 13. Louise. The doctor from Inglewood came very soon, and I went up to see the sick girl with him. Halsey had gone to supervise the fitting of the car with blankets and pillows, and Gertrude was opening and airing Louise's own rooms at the house. Her private sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room were as they had been when we came. They occupied the end of the east wing, beyond the circular staircase, and we had not even opened them. The girl herself was too ill to notice what was being done. When, with the help of the doctor, who was a fatherly man with a family of girls at home, we got her to the house and up the stairs into bed, she dropped into a feverish sleep, which lasted until morning. Dr. Stewart, that was the Inglewood doctor, stayed almost all night, giving the medicine himself, and watching her closely. Afterward he told me that she had had a narrow escape from pneumonia, and that the cerebral symptoms had been rather alarming. I said I was glad it wasn't an itis sort of thing, anyhow, and he smiled solemnly. He left after breakfast, saying that he thought the worst of the danger was over, and that she must be kept very quiet. The shock of 2 deaths, I suppose, has done this, he remarked, picking up his case. It has been very deplorable. I hastened to set him right. She does not know of either, doctor, I said. Please do not mention them to her. He looked as surprised as a medical man ever does. I do not know the family, he said, preparing to get into his top buggy. Young Walker, down in Casanova, has been attending them. I understand he is going to marry this young lady. You have been misinformed, I said stiffly. Miss Armstrong is going to marry my nephew. The doctor smiled as he picked up the reins. Young ladies are very changeable these days, he said. We thought the wedding was to occur soon. Well, I will stop in this afternoon to see how my patient is getting along. He drove away then, and I stood looking after him. He was a doctor of the old school, of the class of family practitioner that is fast dying out, a loyal and honorable gentleman who was at once physician and confidential adviser to his patients. When I was a girl, we called in the doctor alike when we had measles, or when mother's sister died in the far west. He cut out redundant tonsils and brought the babies with the same air of inspiring self-confidence. Nowadays, it requires a different specialist for each of these occurrences. When the babies cried, old Dr. Wainwright gave them peppermint and dropped warm sweet oil in their ears with sublime faith that if it was not colic, it was earache. When, at the end of a year, father met him driving in his high sidebar buggy with the white mare ambling along, and asked for a bill, the doctor used to go home, estimate what his services were worth for that period, divide it in half, I don't think he kept any books, and send father a statement, in a cramped hand, on a sheet of ruled white paper. He was an honored guest at all the weddings, christenings, and funerals. Yes, funerals, for everyone knew that he had done his best, and there is no gainsaying the ways of Providence. Ah, well, Dr. Wainwright is gone, and I am an elderly woman with an increasing tendency to live in the past. The contrast between my old doctor at home and the Casanova doctor, Frank Walker, always rouses me to wrath and aggression. Sometime about noon of that day, Wednesday, Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh telephoned me. I have the barest acquaintance with her. She managed to be put on the governing board of the old ladies' home, and ruins their digestions by sending them ice cream and cake on every holiday. Beyond that, and her reputation at bridge, which is insufferably bad, she is the worst player at the bridge club, I know little of her. It was she who had taken charge of Arnold Armstrong's funeral, however, and I went at once to the telephone. "Yes," I said, "this is Miss Innes." "Miss Innes," she said volubly, "I have just received a very strange telegram from my cousin, Mrs. Armstrong. Her husband died yesterday in California, and— Wait, I will read you the message." I knew what was coming, and I made up my mind at once. If Louise Armstrong had a good and sufficient reason for leaving her people and coming home, a reason, moreover, that kept her from going at once to Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh, and that brought her to the lodge at Sunnyside instead, it was not my intention to betray her. Louise herself must notify her people. I do not justify myself now, but remember, I was in a peculiar position toward the Armstrong family. I was connected most unpleasantly with a cold-blooded crime, and my niece and nephew were practically beggared, either directly or indirectly, through the head of the family. Mrs. Fitzhugh had found the message. "Paul died yesterday. Heart disease," she read. "Wire at once if Louise is with you. You see, Miss Innes, Louise must have started east, and Fanny is alarmed about her." "Yes," I said. "Louise is not here," Miss Fitzhugh went on, "and none of her friends, the few who are still in town, have seen her. I called you because Sunnyside was not rented when she went away, and Louise might have gone there." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fitzhugh, but I cannot help you," I said, and was immediately filled with compunction. Suppose Louise grew worse. Who was I to play Providence in this case? The anxious mother certainly had a right to know that her daughter was in good hands. So I broke in on Mrs. Fitzhugh's voluble excuses for disturbing me. "Mrs. Fitzhugh," I said, "I was going to let you think I knew nothing about Louise Armstrong, but I have changed my mind. Louise is here, with me." There was a clatter of ejaculations at the other end of the wire. "She is ill, and not able to be moved. Moreover, she is unable to see anyone. I wish you would wire her mother that she is with me and tell her not to worry. No, I do not know why she came east." "But, my dear Miss Innes," Miss Fitzhugh began. I cut in ruthlessly. "I will send for you as soon as she can see you," I said. "No, she is not in a critical state now, but the doctor says she must have absolute quiet." When I had hung up the receiver, I sat down to think. So Louise had fled from her people in California and had come east alone. It was not a new idea, but why had she done it? It occurred to me that Dr. Walker might be concerned in it, might possibly have bothered her with unwelcome attentions. but it seemed to me that Louise was hardly a girl to take refuge in flight under such circumstances. She had always been high-spirited, with the well-poised head and buoyant step of the outdoors girl. It must have been much more in keeping with Louise's character, as I knew it, to resent vigorously any unwelcome attentions from Dr. Walker. It was the suitor whom I should have expected to see in headlong flight, not the lady in the case. The puzzle was no clearer at the end of the half-hour. I picked up the morning papers, which were still full of the looting of the Traders' Bank, the interest at fever height again, on account of Paul Armstrong's death. The bank examiners were working on the books and had said nothing for publication. John Bailey had been released from on bond. The body of Paul Armstrong would arrive Sunday and would be buried from the Armstrong town house. There were rumors that the dead man's estate had been a comparatively small one. The last paragraph was the important one. Walter P. Broadhurst of the Marine Bank had produced 200 American traction bonds, which had been placed as security with the Marine Bank for a loan of $160,000 made to Paul Armstrong just before his California trip. The bonds were a part of the missing traction bonds from the Traders' Bank. While this involved the late president of the wrecked bank, to my mind it by no means cleared its cashier. The gardener mentioned by Halsey came out about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and walked up from the station. I was favorably impressed by him. His references were good. He had been employed by the Bradys until they went to Europe, and he looked young and vigorous. He asked for one assistant, and I was glad enough to get off so easily. He was a pleasant-faced young fellow, with black hair and blue eyes, and his name was Alexander Graham. I have been particular about Alex because, as I said before, he played an important part later. That afternoon I had a new insight into the character of the dead banker. I had my first conversation with Louise. She sent for me, and against my better judgment I went. There were so many things she could not be told in her weakened condition that I dreaded the interview. It was much easier than I expected, however, because she asked no questions. Gertrude had gone to bed, having been up almost all night, and Halsey was absent on one of those mysterious absences of his that grew more and more frequent as time went on, until it culminated in the event of the night of June the 10th. Liddy was in attendance in the sick room. There being little or nothing to do, she seemed to spend her time smoothing the wrinkles from the counterpane. Louise lay under a field of virgin white, folded back at an angle of geometrical exactness, and necessitating a readjustment every time the sick girl turned. Liddy heard my approach and came out to meet me. She seemed to be in a perpetual state of goose-flesh, and she had got in the habit of looking past me when she talked, as if she saw things. It had the effect of making me look over my shoulder to see what she was staring at, and was intensely irritating. "She's awake," Liddy said, looking uneasily down the circular staircase, which was beside me. "She was talking in her sleep something awful, about dead men and coffins." "Liddy," I said sternly, "did you breathe a word about everything not being right here?" Liddy's gaze had wandered to the door of the chute, now bolted securely. "Not a word," she said, "beyond asking her a question or two, which there was no harm in. She says there never was a ghost known here." I glared at her, speechless, and closing the door into Louise's boudoir, to Liddy's great disappointment, I went on to the bedroom beyond. Whatever Paul Armstrong had been, he had been lavish with his stepdaughter. Gertrude's rooms at home were always beautiful apartments, but the 3 rooms in the east wing at Sunnyside, set apart for the daughter of the house, were much more splendid. From the walls to the rugs on the floor, from the furniture to the appointments of the bath, with its pool sunk in the floor instead of the customary unlovely tub, everything was luxurious. In the bedroom, Louise was watching for me. It was easy to see that she was much improved. The flush was going, and the peculiar gasping breathing of the night before was now a comfortable and easy respiration. She held out her hand, and I took it between both of mine. "What can I say to you, Miss Innes?" she said slowly. "To have come like this—" I thought she was going to break down, but she did not. "You are not to think of anything but of getting well," I said, patting her hand. "When you are better, I am going to scold you for not coming here at once. This is your home, my dear, and of all people in the world, Halsey's old aunt ought to make you welcome." She smiled a little, sadly, I thought. "I ought not to see Halsey," she said. "Miss Innes, there are a great many things you will never understand, I am afraid. I am an impostor on your sympathy, because I stay here and let you lavish care on me, and all the time I know you are going to despise me." "Nonsense," I said briskly. "Why, what would Halsey do to me if I ever ventured such a thing? He is so big and masterful that if I dared to be anything but rapturous over you, he would throw me out of a window. Indeed, he would be quite capable of it." She seemed scarcely to hear my facetious tone. She had eloquent brown eyes. The Inneses are fair, and are prone to a grayish-green optic that is better for use than appearance, and they seemed now to be clouded with trouble. "Poor Halsey," she said softly. "Miss Innes, I cannot marry him, and I am afraid to tell him. I am a coward, a coward." I sat beside the bed and stared at her. She was too ill to argue with, and besides, sick people take queer fancies. "We will talk about that when you are stronger," I said gently. "But there are some things I must tell you," she insisted. "You must wonder how I came here, and why I stayed hidden at the lodge. Dear old Thomas has been almost crazy, Miss Innes. I did not know that Sunnyside was rented. I knew my mother wished to rent it, without telling me, my stepfather, but the news must have reached her after I left. When I started east, I had only one idea: to be alone with my thoughts for a time, to bury myself here. Then I must have taken a cold on the train." "You came east in clothing suitable for California," I said, "and, like all young girls nowadays, I don't suppose you wear flannels." But she was not listening. "Miss Innes," she said, "has my step-brother Arnold gone away?" "What do you mean?" I asked, startled. But Louise was literal. "He didn't come back that night," she said, "and it was so important that I should see him." "I believe he has gone away," I replied uncertainly. "Isn't it something that we could attend to instead?" But she shook her head. "I must do it myself," she said dully. "My mother must have rented Sunnyside without telling my stepfather, and, Miss Innes, did you ever hear of anyone being wretchedly poor in the midst of luxury? Did you ever long and long for money, money to use without question, money that no one would take you to task about? My mother and I have been surrounded for years with every indulgence, everything that would make a display. But we never had any money, Miss Innes. That must have been why Mother rented this house. My stepfather pays our bills. It's the most maddening, humiliating existence in the world. I would love honest poverty better." "Never mind," I said. "When you and Halsey are married, you can be as honest as you like, and you will certainly be poor." Halsey came to the door at that moment, and I could hear him coaxing Liddy for admission to the sick room. Shall I bring him in? I asked Louise, uncertain what to do. The girl seemed to shrink back among her pillows at the sound of his voice. I was vaguely irritated with her. There are few young fellows like Halsey, straightforward, honest, and willing to sacrifice everything for the one woman. I knew one once, more than 30 years ago, who was like that. He died a long time ago, and sometimes I still take out his picture, with its cane and its queer silk hat, and look at it. But of late years it has grown too painful. He is always a boy, and I am an old woman. I would not bring him back if I could. Perhaps it was some such memory that made me call out sharply, "Come in, Halsey." And then I took my sewing and went into the boudoir beyond to play propriety. I did not try to hear what they said, but every word came through the open door with curious distinctness. Halsey had evidently gone over to the bed, and I supposed he kissed her. There was silence for a moment, as if words were superfluous things. "I have almost been wild, sweetheart," Halsey's voice. "Why didn't you trust me and send for me before?" "It was because I couldn't trust myself," she said in a low tone. "I am too weak to struggle today. Oh, Halsey, how I have wanted to see you." There was something I did not hear. Then Halsey again. "We could go away," he was saying. "What does it matter about any one in the world but just the two of us? To be always together, like this, hand in hand. Louise, don't tell me it isn't going to be. I won't believe you." You don't know, Louise repeated dully. "Halsey, I care, you know that, but not enough to marry you." "That is not true, Louise," he said sternly. "You cannot look at me with your honest eyes and say that." "I cannot marry you," she repeated miserably. "It's bad enough, isn't it? Don't make it worse. Some day, before long, you will be glad." "Then it is because you have never loved me." There were depths of hurt pride in his voice. "You saw how much I loved you, and you let me think you cared, for a while. No, that isn't like you, Louise. There's something you haven't told me. Is it because there is someone else?" "Yes," almost inaudibly. "Louise! Oh, I don't believe it." "It is true," she said sadly. "Halsey, you must not try to see me again. As soon as I can, I am going away from here, where you are all so much kinder than I deserve. And whatever you hear about me, try to think as well of me as you can. I am going to marry another man. How you must hate me, hate me." I could hear Halsey cross the room to the window. Then, after a pause, he went back to her again. I could hardly sit still. I wanted to go in and give her a good shaking. "Then it's all over," he was saying with a long breath. "The plans we made together, the hopes, all of it, over. Well, I'll not be a baby, and I'll give you up the minute you say, I don't love you and I do love someone else." "I cannot say that," she breathed, "but very soon I shall marry the other man." I could hear Halsey's low triumphant laugh. "I defy him," he said. "Sweetheart, as long as you care for me, I am not afraid." The wind slammed the door between the two rooms just then, and I could hear nothing more, although I moved my chair quite close. After a discreet interval, I went into the other room and found Louise alone. She was staring with sad eyes at the cherub painted on the ceiling over the bed, and because she looked tired, I did not disturb her. Chapter 14. An Eggnog and a Telegram. We had discovered Louise at the lodge Tuesday night. It was Wednesday I had my interview with her. Thursday and Friday were uneventful, save as they marked improvement for our patient. Gertrude spent almost all the time with her, and the two had grown to be great friends. But certain things hung over me constantly. The coroner's inquest on the death of Arnold Armstrong, to be held Saturday, and the arrival of Mrs. Armstrong and young Dr. Walker, bringing the body of the dead president of the Traders' Bank. We had not told Louise of either death. Then, too, I was anxious about the children. With their mother's inheritance swept away in the wreck of the bank, and with their love affairs in a disastrous condition, things could scarcely be worse. Added to that, the cook and Liddy had a flare-up over the proper way to make beef tea for Louise, and, of course, the cook left. Mrs. Watson had been glad enough, I think, to turn Louise over to our care, and Thomas went upstairs night and morning to greet his young mistress from the doorway. Poor Thomas! He had the faculty, found still in some old Negroes, who cling to the traditions of slavery days, of making his employer's interest his. It was always we with Thomas. I miss him sorely. Pipe-smoking, obsequious, not overly reliable, kindly old man. On Thursday, Mr. Harton, the Armstrongs' legal adviser, called up from town. He had been advised, he said, that Mrs. Armstrong was coming east with her husband's body and would arrive Monday. He came with some hesitation, he went on, to the fact that he had been further instructed to ask me to relinquish my lease on Sunnyside, as it was Mrs. Armstrong's desire to come directly there. I was aghast. "Here," I said, "surely you are mistaken, Mr. Harton. I should think, after what happened here only a few days ago, she would never wish to come back." "Nevertheless," he replied, "she is most anxious to come. This is what she says: use every possible means to have Sunnyside vacated. Must go there at once." "Mr. Harton," I said testily, "I am not going to do anything of the kind. I and mine have suffered enough at the hands of this family. I rented the house at an exorbitant figure, and I have moved out here for the summer. My city home is dismantled and in the hands of decorators. I have been here 1 week, during which I have had not a single night of uninterrupted sleep, and I intend to stay until I have recuperated. Moreover, if Mr. Armstrong died insolvent, as I believe was the case, his widow ought to be glad to be rid of so expensive a piece of property." The lawyer cleared his throat. "I am very sorry you have made this decision," he said. "Miss Innes, Miss Louise Fitzhugh tells me Louise Armstrong is with you." "She is." "Has she been informed of this double bereavement?" "Not yet," I said. "She has been very ill. Perhaps tonight she can be told." "It is very sad, he said. "I have a telegram for her, Mrs. Innes. Shall I send it out?" "Better open it and read it to me," I suggested. "If it is important, that will save time." There was a pause while Mr. Harton opened the telegram. Then he read it slowly, judicially. "Watch out for Nina Carrington. Home Monday. Signed F.L.W." "Hum," I said. "Watch out for Nina Carrington. Home Monday." "Very well, Mr. Harton. I will tell her, but she is not in condition to watch for anyone." "Well, Miss Innes, if you decide to, relinquish the lease, let me know," the lawyer said. "I shall not relinquish it," I replied, and I imagined his irritation from the way he hung up the receiver. I wrote the telegram down word for word, afraid to trust my memory, and decided to ask Dr. Stewart how soon Louise might be told the truth. The closing of the Traders' Bank I considered unnecessary for her to know, but the death of her stepfather and stepbrother must be broken to her soon, or she might hear it in some unexpected and shocking manner. Dr. Stewart came about 4 o'clock, bringing his leather satchel into the house with a great deal of care, and opening it at the foot of the stairs to show me a dozen big yellow eggs nesting among the bottles. "Real eggs," he said proudly. "None of your anemic store eggs, but the real thing, some of them still warm. Feel them. Eggnog for Miss Louise." He was beaming with satisfaction, and before he left, he insisted on going back to the pantry and making an eggnog with his own hands. Somehow, all the time he was doing it, I had a vision of Dr. Willoughby, my nerve specialist in the city, trying to make an eggnog. I wondered if he ever prescribed anything so plebeian and so delicious. And while Dr. Stewart whisked the eggs, he talked. "I said to Mrs. Stewart," he confided, a little red in the face from the exertion, "after I went home the other day, that you would think me an old gossip for saying what I did about Walker and Miss Louise." "Nothing of the sort," I protested. "The fact is," he went on, evidently justifying himself, "I got that piece of information, just as we get a lot of things, through the kitchen end of the house. Young Walker's chauffeur, Walker's more fashionable than I am, and he goes around the country in a Stanhope car. Well, his chauffeur comes to see our servant girl, and he told her the whole thing. I thought it was probable, because Walker spent a lot of time up here last summer, when the family was here, and besides, Riggs, that's Walker's man, had a very pat little story about the doctor's building a house on this property, just at the foot of the hill. The sugar, please." The eggnog was finished. Drop by drop, the liquor had cooked the egg, and now, with a final whisk, a last toss in the shaker, it was ready, a symphony in gold and white. The doctor sniffed it. "Real eggs, real milk, and a touch of real Kentucky whiskey," he said. He insisted on carrying it up himself, but at the foot of the stairs he paused. "Riggs said the plans were drawn for the house," he said, harking back to the old subject. "Drawn by Houston in town, so I naturally believed him." When the doctor came down, I was ready with a question. "Doctor," I asked, "is there anyone in the neighborhood named Carrington? Nina Carrington?" "Carrington?" He wrinkled his forehead. "Carrington? No, I don't remember any such family. There used to be Covingtons down the creek." "The name was Carrington," I said, and the subject lapsed. Gertrude and Halsey went for a long walk that afternoon, and Louise slept. Time hung heavy on my hands, and I did that I'd fallen into a habit of doing lately. I sat down and thought things over. One result of my meditations was that I got up suddenly and went to the telephone. I had taken the most intense dislike to this Dr. Walker, whom I had never seen, and who was being talked of in the countryside as the fiancé of Louise Armstrong. I knew Sam Houston well. There had been a time, when Sam was a good deal younger than he is now, before he married Anne Endicott, when I knew him even better. So now I felt no hesitation in calling him over the telephone. But when his office boy had given way to his confidential clerk, and that functionary had condescended to connect his employer's desk telephone, I was somewhat at a loss as to how to begin. "Why, how are you, Rachel?" Sam asked sonorously. "Going to build that house at Rocksview?" It was a 20-year-old joke of his. "Sometime, perhaps," I said. "Just now, I want to ask you a question about something which is none of my business." "I see you haven't changed an iota in a quarter of a century, Rachel. This was intended to be another jest. "Ask ahead. Everything but my domestic affairs is at your service." "Try to be serious," I said, "and tell me this. Has your firm made any plans for a house recently, for a Dr. Walker at Casanova?" "Yes, we have." "Where was it to be built? I have a reason for asking." "It was to be built, I believe, on the Armstrong place. Mr. Armstrong himself consulted me, and the inference was, in fact I am quite certain, the house was to be occupied by Mr. Armstrong's daughter, who is engaged to marry Dr. Walker." When the architect had inquired for the different members of the family, and had finally rung off, I was certain of one thing. Louise Armstrong was in love with Halsey, and the man she was going to marry was Dr. Walker. Moreover, this decision was not new. Marriage had been contemplated for some time. There must certainly be some explanation, but what was it? That day I repeated to Louise the telegram Mr. Wharton had opened. She seemed to understand, but an unhappier face I have never seen. She looked like a criminal whose reprieve is over, and the day of execution approaching. Chapter 15. Liddy gives the alarm. The next day, Friday, Gertrude broke the news of her stepfather's death to Louise. She did it as gently as she could, telling her first that he was very ill, and finally that he was dead. Louise received the news in the most unexpected manner, and when Gertrude came out to tell me how she had stood it, I think she was almost shocked. "She just lay and stared at me, Aunt Ray," she said. "Do you know, I believe she is glad, and she is too honest to pretend anything else. What sort of man was Mr. Paul Armstrong, anyhow?" "He was a bully as well as a rascal, Gertrude," I said, "but I'm convinced of one thing. Louise will send for Halsey now, and they will make it all up." For Louise had steadily refused to see Halsey all that day, and the boy was frantic. We had a quiet hour, Halsey and I, that evening, and I told him several things, about the request that we give up the lease to Sunnyside, about the telegram to Louise, about the rumors of an approaching marriage between the girl and Dr. Walker, and, last of all, my own interview with her the day before. He sat back in a big chair, with his face in the shadow, and my heart ached for him. He was so big and so boyish. When I had finished, he drew a long breath. "Whatever Louise does," he said, "nothing will convince me, Aunt Ray, that she doesn't care for me. And up to 2 months ago, when she and her mother went west, I was the happiest fellow on earth. Then something made a difference. She wrote me that her people were opposed to the marriage, that her feeling for me was what it had always been, but that something had happened which had changed her ideas as to the future. I was not to write until she wrote me, and whatever occurred, I was to think the best I could of her. It sounded like a puzzle. When I saw her yesterday, it was the same thing, only, perhaps, worse." "Halsey," I asked, "have you any idea of the nature of the interview between Louise Armstrong and Arnold the night he was murdered?" "It was stormy. Thomas says once or twice he almost broke into the room, he was so alarmed for Louise." "Another thing, Halsey," I said, "have you ever heard Louise mention a woman named Carrington, Nina Carrington?" "Never," he said positively. For try as we would, our thoughts always came back to that fatal Saturday night and the murder. Every conversational path led to it, and we all felt that Jamieson was tightening the threads of evidence around John Bailey. The detective's absence was hardly reassuring. He must have had something to work on in town, or he would have returned. The papers reported that the cashier of the Traders' Bank was ill in his apartments at the Knickerbocker, a condition not surprising considering everything. The guilt of the defunct president was no longer in doubt. The missing bonds had been advertised, and some of them discovered. In every instance they had been used as collateral for large loans, and the belief was current that not less than $1.5 million had been realized. Everyone connected with the bank had been placed under arrest and released on heavy bond. Was he alone in his guilt, or was his cashier his accomplice? Where was the money? The estate of the dead man was comparatively small. A city house on a fashionable street, Sunnyside, a large estate largely mortgaged, an insurance of $50,000, and some personal property. This was all. The rest lost in speculation, probably, the papers said. There was one thing which looked uncomfortable for Jack Bailey. He and Paul Armstrong together had promoted a railroad company in New Mexico, and it was rumored that together they had sunk large sums of money there. The business alliance between the two men added to the belief that Bailey knew something of the looting. His unexplained absence from the bank on Monday lent color to the suspicion against him. The strange thing seemed to be his surrendering himself on the point of departure. To me, it seemed the shrewd calculation of a clever rascal. I was not actively antagonistic to Gertrude's lover, but I meant to be convinced, one way or the other. I took no one on faith. That night the Sunnyside ghost began to walk again. Liddy had been sleeping in Louisa's dressing room on a couch, and the approach of dusk was a signal for her to barricade the entire suite. Situated as it was, beyond the circular staircase, nothing but an extremity of excitement would have made her pass it after dark. I confess myself that the place seemed to me to have a sinister appearance, but we kept that wing well lighted, and until the lights went out at midnight it was really cheerful if one did not know its history. On Friday night, then, I had gone to bed, resolved to go at once to sleep. Thoughts that insisted on obtruding themselves I pushed resolutely to the back of my mind, and I systematically relaxed every muscle. I fell asleep soon, and was dreaming that Dr. Walker was building his new house immediately in front of my windows. I could hear the thump-thump of the hammers, and then I waked to a knowledge that somebody was pounding on my door. I was up at once, and with the sound of my footsteps on the floor the low knocking ceased, to be followed immediately by sibilant whispering through the keyhole. "Miss Rachel! Miss Rachel!" somebody was saying over and over. "Is that you, Liddy?" I asked, my hand on the knob. "For the love of mercy, let me in," she said in a low tone. She was leaning against the door, for when I opened it she fell in. She was greenish-white, and she had a red and black barred flannel petticoat over her shoulders. "Listen," she said, standing in the middle of the floor and holding on to me. "Oh, Miss Rachel, it's the ghost of that dead man hammering to get in." Sure enough, there was a dull thud, thud, thud from some place near. It was muffled. One rather felt than heard it, and it was impossible to locate. One moment it seemed to come, 3 taps and a pause, from the floor under us. The next, thud, thud, thud. It came apparently from the wall. "It's not a ghost," I said decidedly. "If it was a ghost it wouldn't rap. It would come through the keyhole." Liddy looked at the keyhole. "But it sounds very much as though someone is trying to break into the house." Liddy was shivering violently. I told her to get me my slippers, and she brought me a pair of kid gloves. so I found my things myself and prepared to call Halsey. As before, the night alarm had found the electric lights gone. The hall, save for its night lamp, was in darkness as I went across to Halsey's room. I hardly know what I feared, but it was a relief to find him there, very sound asleep, and with his door unlocked. "Wake up, Halsey," I said, shaking him. He stirred a little. Liddy was half in and half out of the door, afraid as usual to be left alone, and not quite daring to enter. Her scruples seemed to fade, however, all at once. She gave a suppressed yell, bolted into the room, and stood tightly clutching the footboard of the bed. Halsey was gradually waking. "I've seen it," Liddy wailed. "A woman in white down the hall." I paid no attention. "Halsey," I persevered, "someone is breaking into the house. Get up, won't you?" "It isn't our house," he said sleepily, and then he roused to the exigency of the occasion. "All right, Aunt Ray," he said, still yawning. "If you'll let me get into something." It was all I could do to get Liddy out of the room. The demands of the occasion had no influence on her. She had seen the ghost, she persisted, and she wasn't going into the hall. But I got her over to my room at last, more dead than alive, and made her lie down on the bed. The tappings, which seemed to have ceased for a while, had commenced again, but they were fainter. Halsey came over a few minutes later and stood listening and trying to locate the sound. "Give me my revolver, Aunt Ray," he said, and I got it, the one I had found in the tulip bed, and gave it to him. He saw Liddy there and divined at once that Louise was alone. "You let me attend to this fellow, whoever it is, Aunt Ray, and go to Louise, will you? She may be awake and alarmed." So in spite of her protests, I left Liddy alone and went back to the east wing. Perhaps I went a little faster past the yawning blackness of the circular staircase, and I could hear Halsey creaking cautiously down the main staircase. The rapping, or pounding, had ceased, and the silence was almost painful. And then, suddenly, from apparently under my very feet, there rose a woman's scream, a cry of terror that broke off as suddenly as it came. I stood frozen and still. Every drop of blood in my body seemed to leave the surface and gather around my heart. In the dead silence that followed, it throbbed as if it would burst. More dead than alive, I stumbled into Louise's bedroom. She was not there. And I think that's a good place to stop for the night. Hey, Dojilon. Welcome in. Glad you made it in. This is an interesting story. I'm amazed by how much is going on. I like that she does kind of remind you of bits of it when she refers to them, and keeps referring to a lot of them to help you keep track of the different mysteries. Yeah, I can still safely say I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but all will be revealed in the end, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm enjoying this story. It's pretty fast-paced, and I like Rachel Innes's voice. I think I ended up doing an extra chapter more than I said, since it was... Well, that last chapter tonight was rather short, and I still had energy reserves, and wanted to see what happened next. But it is late, and I do have work tomorrow, and God, I gotta finish fixing my cane up. And other things. Yeah, I agree. It is pretty interesting, Dojilon. And see why this book's been adapted a couple times. So I'll go ahead and find us a raid target. But first, what's coming up on streams? On Wednesday, we'll continue, hopefully finish, Leather Goddesses of Phobos. Okay, that's about enough luck. And Saturday, we'll play short horror. We'll have Short Horror Saturday, and I plan to play the freeware game by Dave Gilbert that was an early prototype for the Blackwell series. And then Sunday, we'll continue Blackwell Epiphany. Oh yeah, fun stuff in the future. Let's see. Who is online? Let's see. Stan is doing art. Atari Beer Pong's playing old Atari games. Oh, Avuzal's playing Marathon 2. Dragon's playing Cuphead. Oh, TechLink is on. I should raid TechLink. I know he doesn't stream that often, but he's been streaming a little more the last few days. And he's playing Grits? Chill artistic puzzle game called Grits. Interesting name. Damn it, now I want cheese grits. Yeah, there we go. Oh, good. I don't know if I said good night. Good night, Dojilon. And thank you guys all for coming to hang out and listen to more of the story. Yeah, appreciate everybody being here. Especially these audiobook streams, which I think sometimes are more popular in VOD form. As you guys probably know, you can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random thoughts. And you can find VODs of my past streams on YouTube. I'm quite tired. So I hope you all have a good night. Don't dream about female ghosts wandering on circular staircases. Helix doom ladders. Excuse me. I'll see you guys here on Wednesday for sexy interactive fiction. And everybody stick around and say hi to TechLink.